At 6:45 a.m. in the dim stairwell between the third and fourth floors, Mrs. Markova noticed a small metal film canister lying near the radiator, still warm to the touch. She paused, looking up and down the unlit corridor, her eyes adjusting to the gray shape of each landing. The hallway smelled faintly of last night's coal dust. She kept one hand close to the banister, as if that detail alone could anchor her firmly to the morning she expected to have. She had been on her way to fetch a bucket of hot water from the tap on the ground floor. That was her routine on cold weekdays: descend the stairwell before most residents were awake, collect the water, return to her flat before her husband emerged from the bedroom. The repetition of it had always calmed her. But the metal canister resting by the radiator's chipped paint was not part of any routine she knew. She bent slowly, glancing at the third-floor landing. No sound. A door with peeling green paint stood slightly ajar, as it often did. The resident worked night shifts. She shifted her attention back to the canister. It bore no label, only a smudge across the lid and a faint, oily fingerprint recent enough that it remained distinct rather than blurred. Without meaning to, she extended her fingers and touched the metal. Warm. Not warm from the radiator, but warm as if someone had just held it. She should have called the custodian. That would have been the expected harmless act. Yet she didn't. Instead, she folded her hand around the canister and slipped it into the pocket of her housecoat, pressing the fabric flat so the shape wouldn't protrude. For a moment, she stood perfectly still, listening for footsteps or the rattle of keys. Nothing moved in the stairwell except the thin drift of coal soot along the window ledge. As she descended, she checked each landing. On the second floor, she thought she heard a door latch shift, a subtle click quickly silenced. She waited 1 foot on the next step until the quiet returned. When she reached the ground floor, the custodian's office door was shut, the key dangling from the lock on the inside. He was likely awake, but he never opened to residents this early. His routines were as fixed as hers. At the tap, she filled the bucket. Steam rose, clouding the dim corridor. She glanced back up the stairwell. A shape leaned briefly over the railing on the third floor, just the crest of a shoulder, a segment of coat. Then it withdrew. She couldn't tell who it had belonged to. Carrying the bucket, she began the slow climb back up. The water sloshed softly against the metal rim. When she passed the second floor again, the same door latch clicked once more, this time sharper, as if the door had been opened slightly, then closed again. She kept walking, not hurrying but not pausing, letting the steady weight of the bucket give her an excuse not to turn around. On the third floor, she risked a glance toward the radiator. The spot where she had found the film roll appeared untouched, save for a slight indentation in the dust. Whoever had dropped it or searched for it had been there recently enough to know the exact place. She reached her own landing on the fourth floor. Her flat door showed no sign of disturbance. Light from the window at the end of the corridor revealed a thin track of moisture where someone's shoe had dragged across the tiles earlier, still wet. It led down the stairs rather than up. Inside her flat, she set the bucket near the sink. The canister remained in her pocket, a solid weight she couldn't ignore. She removed it carefully, wiped her hand on a dish towel, and examined the surface again. A hairline dent near the rim suggested it had been dropped with force. She considered leaving it on the kitchen table until her husband woke, but doing so felt like exposing something private. Instead, she opened the drawer beneath the bread box, the one that stuck unless pulled firmly. She placed the canister inside and closed the drawer with both hands, listening to the wood catch. Before she stepped away, she looked through the peephole of her flat door. The corridor was empty, yet she felt certain someone had watched her carry the canister away. The stairwell looked different to Mrs. Markova later that afternoon, though nothing had changed except her awareness. The dust on the banister, the flaking paint, the single dim bulb humming above the second-floor landing, everything seemed to hold a sharper edge, as if the building itself were alert. She descended with a small bundle of laundry to hang in the courtyard. On the third-floor landing, she noticed the custodian kneeling beside the radiator, with a cloth wiping along the metal edge. His movements were slow, deliberate. A tin canister larger than the one she had found rested on the step beside him. He didn't look up when she approached. "Dropped it," he muttered, as if answering a question she hadn't asked. She set her laundry basket against the wall. "Someone's been leaving things here," she said quietly. At that, he paused, the cloth stilled in his hand. For a moment she thought he might say something more, but instead he only shrugged. People lose things. It happens. The tone wasn't dismissive so much as careful. She watched his eyes. They didn't roam, didn't scan for threats. They stayed locked on the radiator as if it alone required absolute concentration. The larger canister on the step bore a faint mark on its lid, 2 parallel scratches like someone had pressed it too tightly while fastening. The custodian slid it into his coat pocket without bothering to wipe it off. He stood nodded once and moved toward the stairwell door leading to the basement. One highlight sharply drawn the custodian behaving as if the discovery were expected. She picked up her basket and continued downward. Though she told herself not to look back, she did, and caught the custodian glancing up toward her, his expression unreadable in the half-light. Outside, laundry lines stretched across the courtyard. A few neighbors were already there, pegging shirts, scarves, and worn trousers. Conversations drifted in low, unfinished phrases. "Heard they came last night, something on the 3rd floor, just routine inspections," they said. No one addressed her directly, but she sensed the lines of attention shifting whenever she moved. The courtyard felt unusually exposed, as though windows across the building had become a ring of silent watchers. She hung her laundry methodically. A shirt, a towel, another towel. She kept her gestures steady. She didn't want to join the threads of whispered speculation forming in the air. As she reached for a clothespin, a thump echoed from the stairwell door. She turned just in time to see a man climbing the steps briskly, the courier Mr. Sidorov. His coat flapped slightly at the hem, revealing a tear along the inner lining. It wasn't a fresh tear. The edges were worn frayed. He nodded at her in passing. "Afternoon." His voice carried nothing unusual, but he held his left arm close to his body, protecting the torn lining. She noticed a dark thread caught on the edge of the step he had just climbed. A thread matching the color of his coat. She waited until he disappeared inside, then bent to examine the thread. It was coarse and faintly stiff, as though treated with something. Chemical adhesive. She didn't touch it, she only looked, then stood again, steadying her breath. A second highlight, the torn coat, and the courier's guarded posture. Later, as she crossed the courtyard back toward the entrance, 2 women leaned together near the benches. Their conversation stopped when she passed. One offered a tight smile, the other looked away. The silence carried too much shape. Inside the stairwell, the dim bulb flickered once. Someone had recently passed through. A faint trace of damp footprints led from the entrance to the 2nd floor, then veered toward the custodian's office. Before going upstairs, she opened the small drawer beneath the bread box just to check. The film canister was still there, motionless in the dark. She closed the drawer carefully. The flat was silent, but she felt the sense of being observed, soft, persistent, like a weight in the air that didn't belong to her. The district clerk Anton Lebedev arrived at his desk just after 8:00 a.m., placing his satchel carefully on the floor, as he always did. The building was cold this morning, colder than usual, and the radiators in the administrative office clanged unevenly. He removed his gloves, folded them into his coat sleeve, and reached for the stack of forms left for him overnight. Most were routine residency confirmations, hallway maintenance complaints, a request for replacement keys. But one sheet stood out immediately. A building notice concerning stairwell disturbances had been filed twice, once under the correct route number, and once under a number that had been retired 3 years earlier. The signatures at the bottom did not match. He held the 2 copies side by side. One bore the custodian's cramped handwriting, The other displayed a broader, more deliberate script. Both claimed to describe minor noise complaints between the third and fourth floors. Neither mentioned a lost item. The absence felt intentional. Lebedev kept his desk tidy, but he placed these two forms directly at the center edge to edge. He leaned closer. The ink on the misfiled notice was slightly smeared as though the writer had pressed too hard and then hesitated. A co-worker entered the office, nodding and passing. "Morning. New inspection directives coming down today." Lebedev acknowledged with a brief sound. He didn't elaborate. He rarely did. He turned the forms over and checked the timestamp. One had been submitted just before closing, the other some time after. The night custodian often slipped documents under the office door, but the second signature did not resemble his. Someone else had used the custodian's authority line. He pulled the building's resident list from the cabinet, flipping to the address marked on the forms. 3rd and 4th floors. A courier lived there, Sidorov employed at a factory distribution unit. His records were unremarkable, yet Lebedev paused courier positions, sometimes concealed other functions. He set the list aside and opened a fresh administrative note. He summarized the discrepancy without adding interpretation, just time copies, inconsistent signatures. Then he clipped both forms to the note and placed them in the internal review tray. But after a moment of hesitation, he removed them again and kept them at his desk. Something in the duplicated notice felt off, and he preferred not to let it disappear into the wider stacks. A small vibration in the window glass drew his attention. Down in the courtyard, 2 women were speaking in low voices. One kept glancing at the stairwell entrance. He watched for a moment, noting their expressions, measured, uncertain, not quite gossiping, but circling around something. He returned to the forms. A faint chemical smell came from one of them, barely perceptible but sharper when he brought the paper closer to the light. Some clerks used industrial ink pads, but this wasn't ink. More like residue from a solvent. He rubbed his thumb lightly across the margin. It came back clean. A highlight emerged, the mismatched signatures revealing the first concrete break in a routine trail. Lebedev reached for the building's maintenance log next. He scanned the entries, stopping when he found radiator cleaning 3rd floor landing. The time recorded was early morning, too early for standard maintenance. The custodian had clearly been present before office hours. He wrote a second administrative note, early hour activity inconsistent with schedule. He stopped after the word activity reconsidered, crossed it out neatly, and replaced it with the more neutral movement. He preferred precision. Later, during the midday lull, he walked to the internal archive cabinet. A thin file labeled Stairwell Incidents Block 14 sat near the back. Inside, past water-damaged pages, he saw one older report referencing an unclaimed object left near the same radiator years earlier. The details were sparse, but the recurrence sharpened his attention. Another highlight repeated anomalies clustered in the same place. He closed the file and returned to his desk. In the hallway outside, footsteps approached, slowing near the office door. Someone paused, listening. Then the steps withdrew. Lebedev didn't look up. He simply straightened the 2 conflicting notices again, aligning their corners precisely. Small inconsistencies, he knew, rarely stayed small. Mrs. Markova arrived at the housing office just after noon, holding her coat closed at the collar. The waiting room was nearly empty. 2 wooden chairs, a coat rack missing one hook, a faint smell of burnt dust from the electric heater in the corner. A clerk she didn't recognize directed her to a narrow corridor lined with peeling posters about residency obligations. She was shown into a small interview room, square, windowless, lit by a single overhead bulb that buzzed as it warmed. A metal table stood at the center with a straight-backed chair on either side. On the table sat a glass of water and a thin folder with her name clipped to the cover. The clerk who entered was the same one she had glimpsed once in the courtyard from afar. Precise movements, dark hair combed neatly to one side. He introduced himself without offering a handshake. Routine follow-up regarding a stairwell matter, he said, gesturing for her to sit. She folded her hands in her lap, keeping them still. He opened the folder. There were reports of noises early yesterday morning between the 3rd and 4th floors. You use the stairwell regularly? Yes, she said. I fetch water most mornings. He made a small notation. Did you see anything unusual? Her breath caught, but only slightly. She kept her eyes on the edge of the table. No. He looked at her for a moment too long, just long enough for her to register the weight of the pause. Then he reached into the folder and slid forward a sheet of paper. A transcript, she realized. Typed lines with initials marking who had spoken. This is from the custodian's interview, he said. He mentioned a woman descending shortly before he arrived on his morning rounds. I didn't see him, she replied carefully. He says he saw someone. Another pause. What time did you go down? She gave a time that was close to the truth but not exact. The clerk made another notation, circling it once. He compared her answer to a line on the transcript. A different time had been recorded there 20 minutes apart. A highlight the contradiction between her statement and the custodian sitting exposed on the page between them. He didn't challenge her directly. Instead, he lifted a second sheet from the folder. It appeared to be a maintenance report radiator cleaning 3rd floor landing. She scanned it briefly. The custodian had signed it late in the morning, not early. That didn't align with what she had seen. The clerk placed the two documents side by side. We're just clarifying minor details, he said. His tone was flat neutral, careful. I only went for water, she murmured. He nodded but did not write anything this time. He simply underlined one line in her statement with red pencil once, slowly. The sound of graphite across paper echoed more loudly than she expected in the small room. A second highlight, the red underline marking her words, transforming them into something that could be read several ways. He closed the folder halfway. If any resident reports unusual items or objects found in common areas, he said they are required to notify the custodian or this office. You understand? Yes. Everything is handled through proper channels. Misplaced belongings, lost materials, anything out of the ordinary. She felt the drawer beneath her bread box, in her mind the weight of the hidden film canister inside it. She kept her face still. The clerk studied her a moment longer. Then he pushed the folder aside, aligning it with the corner of the table. Thank you for coming, he said quietly. She rose, smoothing her coat. When she stepped into the corridor, another clerk walked past, carrying a stack of files. She noticed the top file bore the name Sidorov in typed letters. As she made her way out of the building, the noise of typewriters carried faintly from deeper rooms, steady, mechanical, unhurried. The kind of sound that could produce documents that decided futures long before anyone understood they had been written. Outside, the cold air felt sharper than before. She paused on the steps, looking back through the glass door. In the reflection, she saw herself standing there, hands tight at her sides. For the first time, she wondered how many versions of her morning routine had already been recorded, how many interpretations were being shaped in rooms like the one she had just left. Lebedev returned to his desk early the next morning, a slim manila envelope waiting in his inbox. No sender's note. Only his name typed on a narrow strip affixed to the front. He closed the office door halfway, and opened the envelope carefully so the flap wouldn't tear. Inside lay two items, a short movement log detailing courier routes for the previous week, and a folded square of cloth sealed inside a transparent sleeve. He lifted the sleeve first. The fabric sample was small, dark, coarse frayed along one edge, as though cut hurriedly. A faint residue clung to the fibers, leaving a grayish sheen when tilted in the light. He recognized the texture. Distribution couriers often wore heavy coats, but this material held something else, an irregular stiffness that suggested chemical treatment. He tapped the sleeve gently. The residue did not shift. He made a note in his ledger fiber sample from landing possible solvent trace. The residue's quality formed the first highlight physical evidence confirming that something more than routine courier work lingered in that stairwell. He turned to the movement log. It listed times and addresses handwritten with check marks beside each delivery point. The entries for Sidorov's route contained subtle inconsistencies. 2 days in a row, his recorded departure time from the depot occurred after the log claimed he had already reached a building on the opposite side of the district. A neat contradiction, small but unignorable. Lebedev aligned the pages side by side. He drew a thin line between the mismatched times, then cross-referenced the addresses. One entry in particular caught his attention: Block 14. Mrs. Markova's building appeared twice within the same afternoon window, though only one drop was assigned. He considered the possibilities. Clerical error was common, but the handwriting on those entries was too deliberate. Someone had taken care to make the numbers appear routine at a glance. He placed the movement log atop the fiber sample and leaned back. Through the doorway, he could hear the low murmur of colleagues gathering for the morning briefing. Files were shuffled. Chairs scraped lightly against the floor. The atmosphere felt denser today, as though a quiet thread had woven itself through the department. He stood and walked to the archive cabinet again, retrieving the Courier employment file. Sidorov's record, though thin, noted an earlier transfer from a different district. Transfer dates often concealed disciplinary issues or internal adjustments. He flipped to the back. A faded memo mentioned temporary reassignment for operational efficiency, unsigned. Another highlight surfaced. The transfer, paired with the movement log discrepancies, suggested a hidden pattern rather than isolated error. He returned to his desk as a colleague Petrov approached with a sealed communications pouch. "Inspection orders today," Petrov said, lowering his voice. "Your building Block 14 came up in last night's run." Lebedev nodded once. Petrov didn't stay. He moved on, distributing pouches to others. Alone again, Lebedev opened the pouch. Inside was a directive instructing clerks to identify irregularities in courier access routes, focusing on buildings with repeated maintenance reports. Block 14 had accumulated 3 in the past week. That alone justified scrutiny. He placed the directive beside the movement log. The two documents complemented each other too neatly to be coincidence. Around noon, he visited the ground floor records room. The custodian from Block 14 stood near the counter signing a delivery sheet. He looked up briefly, eyes narrowing at the sight of Lebedev. The custodian's hands were steady, but his coat bore a faint smudge near the pocket similar to the residue on the fabric sample. "Morning," the custodian said. Lebedev returned a polite nod. "We're reviewing recent maintenance submissions." Everything was filed correctly. The custodian replied too quickly. Lebedev didn't react. He simply checked the delivery sheet, returned it, and watched as the custodian left the building without glancing back. That haste alone merited note. Later at his desk, Lebedev arranged the fiber sample, the movement log, and the unsigned transfer memo into a single stack. The accumulation of small irregularities no longer felt coincidental. They formed a narrow corridor of facts pointing toward Block 14, toward stairwell landings and early morning routines. He wrote a fourth administrative note, concise but firm. Temporal and material inconsistencies indicate possible unauthorized exchanges. Recommend preliminary route audit. He placed the note into the internal dispatch tray, aligning it precisely with the others. Outside the office window, the district courtyard darkened early. Snow began to fall in slow, uneven flakes, each one settling silently on the stone path. Quiet, methodical, inevitable. Yelena Sidorova noticed the silence first. It settled over the apartment in a way that felt deliberate, as though the air itself held its breath. She stood by the kitchen window, hands resting on the frame, watching the courtyard below. A dusting of snow coated the benches and the narrow path leading to the stairwell entrance. 2 neighbors crossed the yard, carrying parcels, speaking in hushed clips of conversation. Neither looked up at her window. She turned back to the table. Her husband's coat hung over the chair where he had left it the previous night, the torn lining exposed like a wound that had been ignored too long. She approached it slowly, lifting the fabric between her fingers. The rip had grown. Threads curled outward, stiffened by something she couldn't identify. She set the coat back down and listened. Her husband moved in the next room. Footsteps, then stillness. He hadn't spoken much since returning from work. He had undressed quietly, folded his trousers, then sat at the edge of the bed as if sorting through something he couldn't articulate. When she asked if he wanted tea, he only nodded. Now, in the morning light, his reticence felt sharper. A soft knock sounded at the apartment door. Yelena froze. Visitors were rare. Unannounced visitors nearly unheard of. She opened the door cautiously. No one stood in the corridor. Only a thin slip of paper folded twice lay on the floor. She picked it up and scanned the brief message printed in uneven type. Report any irregularities in shared spaces. Anonymous statements accepted. Her name wasn't on it, but the implication weighed heavily. She folded it again, then again, until it was small enough to hide in her palm. The paper was dry and thin, as though it had been through several hands before reaching her door. A highlight formed immediately. The anonymous note, pointed and poorly disguised, signaling that someone in the building or beyond it expected her to watch to participate. She shut the door quietly. When she turned, her husband was standing in the hallway watching her. His eyes went to her hand. "What's that?" he asked. "Just a notice," she said, keeping her tone even. "From the housing office." He held her gaze a moment longer before walking past her to the kitchen. He picked up his coat, examined the torn lining briefly, then set it down again without comment. "Did something happen at work?" she asked. "No," he replied. The words sounded rehearsed. "Routine deliveries. Nothing unusual." His phrasing unsettled her. He rarely spoke in official terms. She poured tea into 2 glasses, setting one near him. He didn't drink. Through the window, she saw Mrs. Markova crossing the courtyard, head lowered, hands clasped inside her coat sleeves. 2 other residents passed her without acknowledgement. The absence of greeting, no nod, no polite pause, stood out starkly. Yelena realized then that the tension wasn't confined to her own flat. Something had shifted in the building. People moved differently, watched differently, avoided differently. She stepped closer to the window. "They're talking," she said quietly. Her husband didn't answer. He had taken the torn coat again, running his fingers along the frayed edge. "Have you heard anything?" he asked without looking at her. "No." He nodded, but the gesture lacked conviction. "If anyone asks questions," he continued, voice low, "keep your answers simple." She set her glass down carefully. Why would they ask anything? A long pause followed. He didn't offer a reason. Later, after he left for work, she collected his coat from the chair. Something about the lining bothered her. The tear had deepened as though it had been tugged repeatedly. She slipped her fingers inside the opening. The pocket interior was empty, but the fabric was worn in a pattern indicating that something had been placed there regularly, pressed against the seam, then removed. She lowered the coat and sat at the kitchen table. Outside, footsteps echoed through the stairwell, measured official. 2 men's voices murmured near the landing, followed by a brief clipped exchange with a resident. A second highlight, neighbors avoiding the Sidorovs and now officials gathering on their landing. She opened the folded notice again and held it flat on the table. The blank space beneath the typed line seemed to wait expectantly, as though her silence could itself be interpreted. For the rest of the morning, she kept to the window, watching the slow accumulation of small movements in the courtyard. Subtle, coordinated, and unmistakably directed toward her family's door, Mrs. Markova checked the drawer beneath the bread box before leaving her flat, intending only to assure herself that the film canister remained untouched. She slid the drawer open halfway, just enough to glimpse inside. The space was empty. She stopped breathing for a moment. The drawer contained only an indentation in the wood where the canister had rested. No dust was disturbed, no objects displaced. It was simply gone. She closed the drawer slowly, listening to the wood catch. The flat was silent. Her husband had already left for work. She moved through each room with deliberate calm: the hallway, the living room, the coat stand. Nothing else appeared out of order. Yet the absence of the canister felt like a presence of its own, altering the air. She left the flat and locked the door, pausing in the corridor. Someone had passed through recently. A thin streak of moisture ran across the floorboards toward the stairwell, the kind left by a boot brushed clean of snow. It tapered off near the railing. Descending the stairs, she kept her hand on the banister the entire time. On the third-floor landing, she paused. The radiator where she had found the canister days earlier looked scrubbed. The dust around it had been wiped away in a tight semicircle too precise to be part of routine cleaning. She crouched and examined the tiles. A tiny metal mark, perhaps from the edge of a lid scratched into the floor, felt recent. She traced it lightly with her fingertip. It aligned exactly with where she had picked up the canister before dawn. A highlight took form, the canister reappearing in the very place she had first seen it, despite her having hidden it inside her flat. She stood and listened. A low murmur floated from the custodian's office below, two voices hushed, deliberate. She leaned closer to the stairwell railing. One voice belonged to the custodian. The other was unfamiliar, firmer, clipped in its cadence. "Not where it was supposed to be," the unfamiliar man said. "Someone moved it," the custodian replied. "Someone in the building." A pause. "I didn't see who." Mrs. Markova stepped back quietly, then continued downward as if she had heard nothing. When she reached the ground floor, the custodian's door opened abruptly. The custodian emerged, accompanied by a man in a dark coat with a stamped badge clipped to his lapel. The man looked at her with a quick, assessing glance, neither hostile nor friendly, but measuring. She nodded politely. The man acknowledged with the slightest movement of his chin. They both watched her ascend the stairs again, her bucket empty, her steps steady. As she reached her landing, she turned once more. The custodian remained below, speaking low to the official. His face stayed expressionless, but something rigid in his posture implied tension. Inside her flat, she stood by the kitchen table, her hands braced against the surface. She replayed the voices in the stairwell. The phrase, "not where it was supposed to be," echoed with particular weight. If they had expected the canister to be in the stairwell, then someone else had returned it there before removing it again, or expected it to remain undisturbed and found her intervention instead. Mid-afternoon, she returned to the stairwell under the pretense of checking the mail slot. As she crossed the second-floor landing, she noticed the custodian speaking with two men near the elevator shaft. Their conversation was almost silent, punctuated by brief gestures. When she stepped into view, the custodian leaned toward them and murmured something she couldn't catch. A second highlight, the custodian whispering to officials in the stairwell as her presence drew their attention. She did not linger. She collected the empty mail slot envelope and climbed back up, aware of the eyes following her progress. In her flat, she locked the door and moved once more to the drawer beneath the bread box. Empty. She placed her fingertips on the wood, feeling the faint outline left by the missing canister. Late in the day, footsteps echoed up the stairwell, slow, formal, not in a resident's rhythm. They paused on every landing. She drew the curtain half closed and waited. Eventually the steps receded. Evening settled, but the building did not relax. Doors closed quietly, conversations thinned. The stairwell, usually a conduit of ordinary domestic noise, held itself unnaturally still. Mrs. Markova understood then that the canister was no longer a misplaced object. It was now part of a sequence she had triggered, one that others were already trying to trace backward to her. Lebedev arrived at the district office before most of the staff, the hallways still dim, the radiator pipes ticking as they warmed. A sealed folder lay on his desk with a red stripe across the top margin, an indicator that a case had shifted from routine oversight to district-level review. He sat down, opened the folder carefully, and scanned the first page. The directive was brief: compile discrepancies in resident statements for Block 14. Prioritize testimonies related to early morning stairwell activity. No explanation, no contextual notes. The absence itself felt deliberate. He spread out the documents he had collected over the previous days: the duplicated maintenance form, the mismatched signatures, the movement log with its unaligned times, and the fiber sample's summary note. All of them pointed toward something irregular, but none framed the issue directly. The new directive implied that someone higher up believed these small fragments were enough to warrant escalation. He opened the transcripts of interviews. 3 statements referred to the same morning, 3 residents, 3 versions of events. The custodian claimed he had seen a woman descending the stairs with a bucket at dawn. Mrs. Markova insisted she had seen no one. A 3rd resident said he had heard the stairwell door open twice within minutes, but had not looked out. The timing among the 3 accounts conflicted by margins too precise to be accidental. A highlight emerged: 3 testimonies, each contradicting the others in exactly the places that mattered. He placed the transcripts side by side, making faint pencil marks between the mismatched lines. Every contradiction formed a small hinge, turning the narrative in a new direction. He didn't need to know which one was true, yet only that they couldn't all be. A knock sounded at his open doorway. A district officer stepped in, a man he recognized from high-level inspections. "We're organizing field checks at Block 14, the officer said. "Your notes indicate irregular courier access." Lebedev nodded once. He had expected this. "There are inconsistencies," he replied. "Nothing definitive yet." "Definitive isn't required," the officer said, voice flat. "Not at this stage." The officer placed a new list on his desk, residents scheduled for follow-up questioning. The courier's name, Sidorov, landed high on the list. Near the bottom sat Markova, not bolded, but present. After the officer left, Lebedev studied the list. The spacing between names, the order, the annotations, each choice revealed priorities. Someone had already formed an internal sequence of suspicion. He added his own brief note in the margin: patterns align with courier route anomalies. He leaned back and considered the stairwell. That narrow space had become the center of the district's attention, a simple concrete structure layered now with implication. Objects found and removed, residents observed, routines broken and redrawn. Halfway through the morning, he reviewed the courier's transfer memo again. The language operational efficiency might as well have been a blank space. Transfers like that often serve to reorganize covert routes under new oversight. If Sidorov's role had extended beyond deliveries, his presence in Block 14 was not accidental. When he returned to the conflicting testimonies, he noticed a line in the custodian's statement referring to items out of place. But the clerk who conducted the interview had not asked what those items were. The omission was curious. He circled it. Another highlight surfaced: custodial awareness of an unnamed object that had already moved through administrative channels before being formally acknowledged. By late afternoon, he drafted a summary for the district's internal briefing. Multiple testimonies inconsistent. Movement logs conflicted with recorded deliveries. Resident behavior indicating elevated tension. Early morning stairwell events recurring. Potential unauthorized exchanges. He kept the language measured: no accusations, no speculations. The administration preferred patterns presented plainly, allowing conclusions to form silently in the gaps. As he walked out of the office that evening, he passed the main bulletin board. A new directive had been posted: orders for a district-wide audit of courier routes. Block 14 appeared on the list, with a thin red line beneath it. Not quite an underline, not quite an emphasis, but enough to imply scrutiny beyond routine review. Outside, the early darkness had settled over the courtyard. Snow edged the stone steps, the lamps glowing faintly through the cold. He paused for a moment, hands in his coat pockets, considering how quickly a single irregular detail, a misplaced form, a contradictory statement could begin to pull at the threads of an entire network. The escalation had begun, and it no longer belonged to any single resident or clerk. It had entered the administrative machinery carried forward by forces that did not slow once set in motion. Yelena waited until the apartment settled into its late evening stillness before she approached the floorboard near the wardrobe. It had lifted slightly during the past week, enough for her to notice it whenever she swept. Tonight, though, the separation looked deliberate rather than incidental, as if someone had pried it up, then pressed it back without committing to the effort. She knelt and eased her fingertips beneath the edge. The board rose with only a faint creak. Beneath it lay a shallow cavity lined with paper scraps and dust. At first glance it held nothing unusual, but then she saw the envelope, thin brown, sealed with a strip of aging adhesive. She lifted it carefully, aware of the shift in the wood beneath her knees. Inside the envelope she found a folded sheet marked with a narrow series of precise lines. They were Courier routes drawn through the district in faint pencil with small circles marking exchange points. The lines were too clean, too intentional to be casual notes. She recognized one address. Block 14. Her pulse quickened, though her breathing remained steady. She unfolded the paper further. Along the margin was a notation in her husband's handwriting: adjust timing if contact delayed. She had seen that script for years in grocery lists and winter ration reminders. Seeing it beside coded routes turned familiarity into a foreign shape. A highlight emerged immediately, the hidden envelope containing route instructions, evidence of her husband's second life. When she replaced the envelope, she heard the front door open. She lowered the floorboard quickly and ran her hands across it to flatten the seam. Her husband entered the hallway and paused, as he often did, long enough to listen, short enough to seem casual. His coat hung in his hand. The torn lining brushed the floor as he stepped inside the kitchen. "You're still awake," he said quietly. "I couldn't sleep." He nodded, placing the coat on the back of the chair. He didn't sit. He remained near the doorway, posture slightly tense. "They asked questions at work," he said. She looked at him steadily. "About what deliveries, routes, things they think I should remember from weeks ago." He rubbed the back of his neck. "They had a list: names, addresses." She didn't speak, waiting for him to continue. "They said it's routine," he added, almost as an afterthought. Routine. The word struck her as brittle. He sat finally, leaning forward with his elbows on the table. The strain around his eyes was unmistakable. He kept blinking as if to clear something he couldn't focus on. She poured tea, though neither reached for it. "What happened this morning?" she asked. He hesitated. "I went to the stairwell," he said, "to check something." "The lining of your coat." He looked up sharply. Then his gaze softened, settling on the torn fabric. "I didn't tear it by accident," he admitted. "There was something I carried there for months. A colleague passed me items. I was supposed to pass them on." Was she asked? "It's not happening now," he said. "Not since the inspections began." He didn't elaborate on what the items were. He didn't need to. She studied his face, creased, tired, older than it had looked the week before. His hands were still, but his breathing betrayed the conflict beneath his calm. "Are you still involved?" she asked. "No," he said, but the delay before the word made it heavy. He rose suddenly and walked to the wardrobe, opening the door. He touched the floorboard she had just lowered. "I used to keep things here," he said softly, as if speaking to himself. She watched him. "Do they know I don't think so?" he replied, though uncertainty lingered in every syllable. "But someone in the building is talking, and someone else is listening." She pictured the corridor outside their flat, The slow footsteps, the notes slipped under doors, the hushed conversations in the stairwell. The building had become a quiet mechanism gathering and channeling information toward unseen centers. He stepped away from the wardrobe and returned to the table. If they find anything, he said, it won't just be me they question. She understood. Families did not remain untouched. A second highlight formed Yelena burning the route instructions, but keeping the matching receipt, an act that revealed both protection and concealed doubt. When he stepped into the bathroom, Yelena retrieved the envelope again. She lit a match, watching the flame curl up the paper, slowly consuming the roots and the margin notes. She held it over the sink until the last ember died. Only when the page was fully gone did she open her palm. A small receipt one that matched the root sheet's date rested there. She folded it tightly and hid it in the lining of her own coat, pressing the seam flat. In the quiet that followed, she understood that the destruction of the paper did not erase the roots. The network frayed, and unraveling still extended through the building and beyond. And her husband, despite his silence, remained entangled in it, whether he admitted it or not. Lebedev joined the inspection team at Block 14 just after 9:00 a.m. The courtyard was tense in its stillness, as if every resident sensed the tightening perimeter. Snow had been trampled into narrow paths, leading from entrance to entrance, each footstep carrying the imprint of a hurried morning routine. He followed the other clerks toward the main stairwell, carrying a clipboard containing the day's instruction sheet, door-to-door verification, focused questions, documentation of any inconsistencies. Inside, the building was quiet. A draft flowed down the stairwell, carrying the faint scent of cold metal and worn coats. Two officers spread out toward different floors, while Lebedev began at the ground level, confirming names against the district registry. Most residents offered short answers, their eyes flicking toward the corridor as if aware that someone else might be listening. Midway through the morning, he encountered the custodian standing stiffly near the elevator shaft, a clipboard of his own clutched too tightly under his arm. His coat bore the same faint smudge near the pocket, unchanged, uncleaned. Routine inspection, Lebedev said, matching the neutral cadence expected in these situations. Of course, the custodian replied. His voice sounded dry, stripped of inflection. Everything's in order. Lebedev asked for maintenance logs. The custodian handed over a folder more quickly than expected. Inside, Lebedev saw entries written in multiple hands, one firm, consistent script, another more hesitant, almost reluctant. A particular line caught his attention. Stairwell, cleaning third floor, 05:15. The time was too early, too close to the window of anomalies. A highlight emerged the logs, revealing multiple contributors, and an early morning note incompatible with official schedules. Lebedev closed the folder and returned it without comment. The custodian avoided his gaze, glancing instead at the upper landings. As Lebedev climbed to the second floor, a door opened quietly. A resident stepped out, then froze at the sight of the inspection team. She offered a tight nod and retreated into her flat. It was a gesture repeated across the building doors, closing fractionally more quickly than usual faces withdrawing from sight. At the third-floor landing, two officers stood outside the Sidorov's door. They were speaking in low, controlled tones, the type reserved for cases not yet publicly acknowledged. Lebedev approached them. Movement logs and administrative irregularities placed this address on the list, one officer said, without being prompted. We're verifying compliance. Lebedev only nodded. Yelena opened the door a moment later. Her posture was calm, but her eyes had the fixed clarity of someone arranging her thoughts before speaking them aloud. Behind her, the apartment looked meticulously orderly. Coat hung evenly, table wiped, clean curtains drawn to a precise symmetry. Lebedev asked to review residency papers. She produced them promptly. The dates were correct, the signatures intact. Nothing on the surface suggested disorder. but the air in the room felt heavy as if something had been recently concealed. "Your husband's route logs require clarification," Lebedev said evenly. "We've identified inconsistencies." Her gaze sharpened at the word inconsistencies, but she did not falter. "He has already spoken to the inspectors at his workplace," she said quietly. Lebedev made a small notation. She watched his hand as he wrote. When the officers stepped inside for the standard inspection, Yelena shifted slightly, positioning herself where she could see both men at once. Her movements were subtle, protective, anticipating their path. The officers checked closets, drawers, the hallway, the kitchen. They found nothing unusual, but each place they opened revealed a space too orderly, as if prepared in advance for scrutiny. As they exited, Lebedev lingered just long enough to notice the faintest smell of extinguished paper in the air, something burnt recently, but not recently enough to leave smoke. Back in the stairwell, he checked his instructions again. Several flats remained, each marked with a small circle for follow-up. The pattern formed a loose arc around the third and fourth floors, an invisible perimeter defining the core of the investigation. By late afternoon, the sweep had produced a stack of notes, missing signatures, altered timetables, inconsistencies, echoed across tenants' statements. The accumulation shifted the inspection from minor irregularity to something broader. Another highlight surfaced: multiple residents implicated not through direct evidence, but through the pattern of absence and caution in their responses. As the team gathered in the courtyard to conclude the day's sweep, Lebedev looked up at the stairwell windows. The building appeared unchanged, same angles, same peeling paint, same muted tones. Yet he could feel the quiet strain within it, the way each landing now held the imprint of questions asked and answers withheld. He placed his notes into the inspection folder, aligning the edges precisely. The process would continue tomorrow, and the building, with its narrow stairwell and carefully managed silences, would continue yielding small fragments of truth, each one tightening the administrative grip around whatever remained hidden in its walls. Mrs. Markova woke before dawn, the stairwell unusually silent. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped into the corridor. The air smelled faintly of cold metal and cleaning solvent, an indication that someone had been through during the night. She moved carefully toward the railing and looked down the shaft. On the third-floor landing, the radiator's dust pattern had shifted again, a precise rectangle wiped clean, as though something had been placed there briefly, then removed. She descended one flight. A piece of paper lay folded beneath the radiator, half tucked into the corner. She hesitated, scanning the hallway for movement, then crouched and lifted it delicately. Inside was a strip of photographic negatives, 3 frames partially exposed. Shadows of buildings, a blurred figure, an outline of a hand passing an object. The images were faint but unmistakably intentional. She held the strip toward the dim light. One frame captured a corner of the stairwell. She recognized the seam of the wall, the shape of the radiator. Someone had taken photographs inside the building. A highlight emerged immediately, photographic proof revealing routes and exchanges embedded within the stairwell itself. She folded the negatives and slipped them into her sleeve. Footsteps sounded above, slow measured. She continued downward, her pace steady. When she reached the ground floor, 2 officials stood near the custodian's office, speaking in short, clipped sentences. They stopped when she passed. One of them held a folder stamped with a narrow red stripe. She recognized the pattern from the housing office, a sign of escalated review. The official tucked the folder beneath his arm, but not before she saw the uppermost page, a chart of addresses, arrows connecting them. One arrow pointed directly at Block 14. She reached the courtyard door and stepped outside. Snow covered the walkway in a thin, even layer. A small cluster of residents stood near the entrance, speaking in low voices. When they saw her approaching, they parted slightly, not meeting her eyes. The isolation had grown sharper, more visible. By late morning, an announcement appeared on the stairwell bulletin board: temporary access restrictions. Await further instruction. The paper was pinned neatly, but its edges trembled in the draft. A few residents gathered to read it. None lingered. She returned to her flat and carefully unrolled the negatives across the kitchen table, aligning them beside a sheet of plain paper. The first frame showed a blurred figure holding a coat, her neighbor's coat, perhaps Sidorov's. The second showed the stairwell corner where she had found the canister. The third revealed a partial view of a document timing marks possibly part of a courier route. She heard voices rising from the stairwell. She moved to the peephole. 2 officers escorted the custodian up the stairs. His face looked drained, resigned. He did not resist. One officer held a cloth-wrapped bundle, small, cylindrical. She recognized the outline instantly. The canister. She stepped back from the door as they passed her landing. Their footsteps were steady, controlled, echoing lightly against the worn wood. Moments later, another team followed, knocking on doors, gathering residents in the courtyard. A second highlight formed officials, linking the canister, the photographic negatives, and the courier routes into a single chain of evidence. Outside the courtyard, filled with a muted tension. Officers read names from a list. The Sidorov's name appeared. Yelena stood near the edge of the group, her hands clasped tightly. Her husband was not beside her. He had been taken earlier that morning quietly from the factory gate. When the courtyard inspection ended, several families were asked to return inside. Others were escorted to waiting vehicles. No raised voices, no visible force, just a series of calm directives carried out in precise order. The machinery of the investigation had fully arrived, and the building could not hold itself apart from it. By early evening, new locks were placed on several doors. Windows along the stairwell were shuttered from the inside. The third-floor landing was cordoned with twine and a printed notice forbidding passage. Mrs. Markova returned to her flat slowly. She sat at the table and placed the negatives in the drawer where the canister had once rested. The drawer creaked faintly, settling into its familiar alignment. The stairwell outside was empty. The radiator sat cold, free of dust for the first time in years. Whatever network had moved silently through the building, objects past routes, concealed exchanges disguised as routine had broken open. Its pathways were now mapped on official forms, its actors identified or removed. She listened to the building breathe in its altered quiet, the weight of absence pressing against each landing. Before dawn, the building felt hollow, as if the air had been drawn out overnight. Mrs. Markova stepped into the corridor with the quiet anticipation of someone expecting to find something changed, though not knowing exactly what. The stairwell light had been replaced. Its glow felt colder, sharper. The familiar hum of the radiator was absent. She descended slowly. Each landing bore the imprint of recent activity, faint scuff marks near door frames, a strip of tape left curled in a corner chalk residue on one wall where an officer had marked measurements the previous evening. The building had been used, examined, and emptied with a kind of administrative precision that left no visible answers, only traces. On the third-floor landing, she stopped. The radiator had been scrubbed to bare metal, its paint scraped clean of dust and the ghostly pattern left by objects placed beside it. The floor tiles beneath it were newly washed. No residue remained, no scratches, no marks in the grout. It looked like a location being reset, prepared for a new purpose, or left deliberately blank so nothing could be inferred. A highlight rose quietly from the scene, the stairwell stripped of its history, the absence colder than any physical detail. Down in the courtyard, a truck idled near the gate. 2 officers stood nearby, checking a clipboard. They spoke in low, clipped tones, the sort used after a case had reached its administrative conclusion. Residents emerged from their flats in small groups called by name. Some carried small suitcases, others held only documents. Faces looked pale, muted, resigned. She saw Yelena among them, coat buttoned tightly, eyes steady but distant. The officers spoke with her briefly, then directed her toward the truck. Yelena offered no protest. Her motions were slow, deliberate. She did not look back at the building. The absence of her husband was conspicuous but not surprising. After the truck departed, silence pooled into the courtyard. Snow lingered in thin patches along the stone path. A few neighbors gathered near the entrance, whispering among themselves, their voices quick and uncertain. When they noticed her, they shifted subtly, allowing distance to open between them. She did not approach. Returning inside, she paused at the bulletin board. Yesterday's notice about access restrictions had been removed. In its place, a new paper had been pinned, "Maintenance Schedule Revision Stairwell Repairs Pending." No mention of the investigation. No reference to the residents who had been escorted away. A second highlight. The official summary quietly erasing the building's recent upheaval, replacing it with the neutral language of routine maintenance. She continued upward. On the fourth-floor landing, she hesitated and looked back. The stairwell seemed narrower than it had a week ago, as if the walls had shifted inward. She imagined the film canister resting again by the radiator, the custodian wiping dust in careful semicircles. The faint sound of early morning footsteps, details she could no longer separate from consequence. Inside her flat, she opened the drawer where she had once hidden the canister. The negatives she had placed there yesterday remained untouched. But even they felt altered by the building's transformation, as if the evidence they contained now pointed only to something already sealed, archived, and unreachable. She closed the drawer gently. At the window, she watched the courtyard settle back into its ordinary rhythm. Children crossed the yard carrying satchels. 2 residents hung laundry beneath the lines. The daily routines resumed as though nothing significant had occurred. Yet the building's silence had changed in texture. It carried a new form of stillness, one shaped by what had been removed rather than what remained. Near noon, the radiator in the stairwell clanged once as the system restarted, the sound echoing upward. She opened her door slightly and listened. The stairwell breathed again, but with a colder, more formal cadence. She stepped back inside and shut the door, the latch clicking with a softness that felt final.